Hello, guys. I'm speaking from Islington. Just got back from Greece. There's a storm breaking behind me. It is the calm before the storm in transfer window terms. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about all the goings on there. Bid for Kylian Mbappe over the coming weeks. But I wanted to talk today about the contract extension of Arsene Wenger. Happened while I was away. Haven't had a chance to talk about it on here. What to say? Well, if I'm honest, I was a little surprised when the news broke about Arsene and Stan Kroenke meeting and deciding on Arsene Wenger staying. I only say that because in the build-up to the FA Cup final, everything Arsene said seemed to me to hint that he might be going. I think on reflection, what he was doing was kind of a power play with the board, making it look as if him leaving was a genuine prospect, maybe trying to make the fans feel a little remorseful about that too. His kind of the career retrospective he gave himself in the wake of the final, the way he spoke about the team as they need to keep the squad together rather than we. I think he was intimating that leaving was a possibility, almost to make us fonder of the news that he was staying. But it was telling to me that when Arsenal announced that his new contract on their official website, they just said Arsenal announce a new contract for Arsene Wenger. That not Arsenal are pleased to announce, not Arsenal are delighted to announce. And to be honest, that's how I feel too. I'm so happy to have won the FA Cup. I'm so grateful for all the service Arsene Wenger has given us. But I still stand by my belief that if you're assessing his performance, that this ought to have been his last season at Arsenal. The cup win is fantastic. The achievement is fantastic. The historic nature of it, superb. But I firmly believe that winning the FA Cup is not the measure of a team's ability and not the measure of a season. We'll look back on it fondly. It was a brilliant day out. I wouldn't swap it for coming in the top four, but it only takes, 6 games, is it, to win the FA Cup? And Arsene Wenger's capable of that. He can produce that. But what he cannot produce is a Premier League campaign capable of challenging at the very, very top. I always think of the FA Cup and I think of Wigan winning it not too long ago. And they were relegated in that season. And in many ways, Arsenal suffered a relegation of their own this season by finally missing out on the top 4 and dropping into the Europa League. Now, what I do recognise is that at this stage, having left the contract so late, having left the decision so late, change was pretty much impossible. We talked about various candidates. Allegri, for example, agreed to do a deal at Juventus a few weeks ago. Almost, you could say if you wanted to, that by dragging it out, Arsene Wenger effectively guaranteed that he would continue because Arsenal couldn't really push on and wouldn't dare make preparations, contingencies for his departure. But I look back to the spring and I think of those 2 games against Bayern Munich, the 5-1, the humiliation of that tie, the humiliation too against West Brom and Palace, which is arguably kind of more meaningful, Watford. And I think that should have been that. I think in my ideal world, Arsene would have realised at that point that he's taken the team kind of as far as he could. And Arsenal would have begun undertaking plans for a new manager. That's what I would have liked to see happen. It didn't happen. And I think both the board and the manager need to take some responsibility for the fact they let this drag on and left us in a situation where change was effectively impossible. I accept, I said on Twitter that this is the most sensible decision in the circumstances, but the circumstances are absurd. They are ridiculous. They're a disgrace. So yes, I probably would have sanctioned Wenger staying on after the cup final, but what was the alternative? We left ourselves in a position where we had very little choice. The mood around the club is positive after the cup final, and in no way do I mean to detract from that, but I still think there are things broken within the club. When you watch Ivan Gazidis' interview about the manager staying on, I think he can barely disguise. I think that he would have liked to move Arsene on. So that relationship between him, the chief executive, and the manager, I think, is still damaged. And although the cup win will have provided a healing balm for the relationship between Wenger and the fans, it will take very little for the wounds to reopen. I'm talking about the possibility of Alexis going, maybe even Mesut Ozil. I'm talking about a couple of early season defeats. The problem for Arsene for the last 3 years has basically been that every single setback has opened a can of worms, and I don't think that's going to go away next season. I think there are still problems within the club. I think there are still issues with the manager. However, I am also still an Arsenal fan, and I will still renew my season ticket, and I will still go to as many games as possible next season, and I will still get excited when we make a signing and be optimistic at the start of 2017-18. I think we've taken the wrong path. I think Arsenal's taken the wrong path. I think that this year was a natural point for it to end, but I thought the same in 2014. Arsene is in real danger of overstaying his welcome. I think in some ways he already has. I would, if you asked me to bet now, I would bet on there being Wenger Out banners at some point next season. And that's uncomfortable for me. I think a new man would have united the supporters in a way that Arsene I don't think can anymore. But he is here for 2 years in all probability. And he has my support. But I have my concerns too. We've got a manager. It's the same old manager. Let's just hope there are a few things that are different next year, because they need to be. Right, back tomorrow or soon with some thoughts on Kylian Mbappe.